and the processes of innovation and transition. And also you are the president of the board of UCLouvain. So thank you very much for accepting to talk today.
Thank you, Caroline. Thank you for the invitation. So I have a difficult task today because I have to speak about social science, and I discovered that among the speakers, I'm probably the only one not having a master or a degree in social sciences. So I will try to do my best. So we all agree, and it was one of the message of today, that the assessment of the biodiversity situation and of the climate situation is giving us a strong alert on the urgency of action. But in fact, the level of action is very low for the moment. And so the question driving my talk is, why is this level of action so low compared to the urgency and the importance of the issue? And there is a framework that is saying that there is a relationship between ecosystem and human based on ecosystem services on one side, and on the other side, on the pressures of human on the ecosystem. That's classic explanation of a first lecture on ecosystem services. And if you put in this framework the political dimension, then you will see that there is a kind of feedback of the human on the system, both by a pressure, by increasing the pressure on the system, and also by trying to manage the ecosystem in order to attenuate the impact of humans on this ecosystem. So there is a space for a discussion on the political dimension of ecosystem services and biodiversity. I will not detail all the dimension of this space because it's a very complex issue, but I will focus on two aspects. The first one is the question of the horizons. What is our intention? Where are we going to? And should we agree on the destination? And the second question is the question of lock-ins. Because if it's not progressing fast towards a new model, it's perhaps because there is lock-ins impeding the dynamic. So first, the question of the future. And the question of the future is probably one of the first questions in the issue of sustainable development, because among the starting point of sustainable development, everybody agrees on the fact that the Dennis Meadows study on the limit of growth is a key element, and it's already coming out of the 70s. And so, in this model of Meadows, there were the claim that if we go along the pathway we are following now, we will face a moment of decline, a moment of very complicated life. And it's still something important for some people, and a lot of young people are really aware of that, and they are really interested in this concept of collapse. But this is a one future approach. And what is interesting is to try to look at different futures. And so when we are looking at IP-based scenario for the future, the proposition is not to say we have only one possible pathway. The proposition is to open the diversity of pathways and to look to compare these different pathways in terms, for example, of fulfilling the Sustainable Development Goals. And so when the IP-base is proposing that, the team is making a comparison of different archetypes, different pathways, and then measuring this pathway towards the Sustainable Development Goals. Another option in the same spirit, because we spoke a lot today about the relationship between biodiversity and farming practices, is a report that was led by the IDRI team in Paris. and it was a proposition to check a scenario for the agroecological future of Europe. It's called the Tifa Scenario. It is about the land use, and they claim that by choosing specific use of land and specifically increasing the grasslands and having a fair use of the other lands for farming practices, it's possible to have a less damaging future for European agriculture and to increase the biodiversity. A third example is a work we did in the Walloon region, the reason why this slide is in French, where we were working on the future of agriculture. And we choose a completely different scale. The IP-based approach is a world level, or at least general level. The IDRI approach is European level. And we choose to work at the Walloon region level, which is small, and to focus only on given sectors, on given supply chain. So the wheat, the potatoes, the meat, and the milk. I will just present the result for the wheat. And so the other choice we made was to try to put all the farmers in the picture. One of the big issues of today's debate on the future of agriculture is this sterile opposition between a good organic system and a very bad conventional system. In fact, real life is not like that. Most of the farmers, they are neither the good ones or the bad ones. They are the in-between ones. So the idea is to try to make a picture of the way wheat is produced today in Wallonia. And in fact, we identified 4 ways of producing wheat, from organic farming at the top to conventional farming at the bottom. In between, you have agroecological farming, meaning people very close to organic, but still using some pesticides. And you have sustainable farming, meaning people coming from the conventional farming, but trying to make efforts to reduce pesticide. The LEAF initiative, for example, in UK. And if you look at the number of the frequency of use of pesticide in the different models, it's coming from 0 for synthetic pesticide in organic farming, as agreeing with the regulation, to 6 in the conventional system, the most intensive one. As already mentioned by Thea, in fact, there is also a trade-off with the yield. The yield of the organic system is around 5 tons an hectare, and the yield of the most conventional one is 10 tons. So there is this 50% difference in yield. The interesting thing is to see how these people are distributed now in Belgium, in Wallonia. And in fact, most of the farmers today, they are not organic and they are not using a lot of pesticide. They are, most of them, in what we call sustainable farming, so trying to reduce the use of pesticide, but still close to the conventional model. And what we were proposing, instead of saying there is good guys and poor guys, what we are proposing is to work on an idea of mixed. So what kind of mixed do we expect in the year 2050? So if you are just going with the 10 years tendency, with the business as usual model, the idea is that we will increase organic, double the share of organic, but in fact, and the very bad system will disappear, but in fact, most of the system will be by sustainable farmers still using quite a lot of pesticide. And so the decrease of the pesticide use will be around 20%. If we are looking to a more transitional approach, more sustainable approach, we can imagine a mix where we have about 44% of organic and a majority of agroecological system. And in this case, you have 70% of decrease in the pesticide use. So there is options for the future. There are just 2 options, but you imagine it's just an Excel file that you can try different combinations to assess different options. And the purpose was to push a debate on that. And the first question is always, we had already this question this afternoon, oh yes, but what about food? If we are using organic, a decrease of 50% of yield, then we will all be dying of food. I will probably be the last in the room, but anyway. So, the idea is to look at the use of wheat today. And astonishingly, the use of wheat today is only 9%. 9% of the share of wheat today in Wallonia is used to make bread and plant-based product. 46% is used to feed animals, 13% is used for exportation, and 32% is used to make biofuels. So I think that if it's the way we use wheat, it's not an issue to say there is a danger for feeding people. It's just a choice, a society choice of what we are doing with the food we are producing. And for the Flemish colleague, they have the same debate for pigs, because you know that pig in Belgium, and mainly in Flanders, it's the ratio is 2.6, so we are producing 2.6 what we are eating. And that's a society's choice for me. But yes, there is and if you transform that, we did a study with Greenpeace on that. In fact, for the moment in Belgium, 40% of the greenhouse gas emission of the livestock sector is due to exportation. So we can immediately reach the EU target, more or less, it's 59, by stopping the exportation. And by the way, 50% of the importation is 50% of the greenhouse gas emission is due to importation of the impact from Latin America. Okay? So this is the globalization of farming system, at least for livestock, which is the biggest contributor to the issue. So I quickly present you 3 levels of scenarios. One at the world level on the global economy, one at the European level, at the agricultural level, and the last one at the Wallonia level on a specific sector, the wheat. And so I think that's my first message, that what we should be able to do in order to have really a place in the debate is to find a way to articulate the debate, the scales, sorry. Because in fact, our study with Greenpeace, or the study on wheat, has an impact for the moment on the society. People are discussing on the future of livestock in Flanders. People are discussing for the moment on the future of potato in Wallonia, based on the fact that they discovered that there is more than one option. And so at this scale, the debate is starting very quickly. But the impact of a change of farming production in Wallonia will never solve the greenhouse gas emission and the biodiversity issue at the world level. On the opposite scenario at the world level are quite interesting for decision maker, but they fail to impulse a debate in the society. So if you compare, all the scenarios are based on land use. It was already mentioned this morning. And if you compare the different levels, you see that you are speaking about different populations of farmers. And for me, the big question, the big challenge is to articulate these scales and make them cross-fostering. And for the moment, we are starting a discussion with the people of Idri to try already to articulate our regional scale with the European scale. The second point I'd like to discuss with you is the question of lock-ins. Usually when people are mentioning that there is an issue with policy decision, the first word is lobby. Yes, if we cannot get rid of pesticides, it's due to Monsanto. Okay? Okay. But the problem is that it's a bit more complex than that. And it was already, and that's a very interesting paper, it was already noted by Cowan and Gunby in 1996. And the title of the paper the paper is magic, sprayed to death. And they mentioned that the dependency to spraying pesticide is so huge that despite all the pressures, it will go on for a long time. And we are now 20 years later, and it's still into debate. So what we did 10 years ago is to try at the system level to try to understand why an option that is very promising, like agroecology, is not having the same importance in the society than propositions such as GM crops. Our purpose was not to make a plaidoyer for agroecology, to say that's the best option. Our purpose was just to understand what is creating the imbalance between these two options. That's the issue. And when you look at the factors that are nurturing this imbalance, in fact, they are numerous. Some factors, they are related to economic dimension, related to issues like competitivity, lobbies, and things like that. Other factors, they are related to the intellectual property, because, for example, GM crops, you can make money from the intellectual property, and it's not the case for agroecology. And there is also a lot of factors related to research organization, like the publish of parish model, the way impact factors are calculated, and things like that. And so none of these factors only can explain the problem. It's the interactions of these factors that are, in fact, making an imbalance between agroecology and other options. And that's a big challenge, because, in fact, GM crops, they are not the wrong pathway, but, in fact, the way they are de facto, the way they are implemented in the society impedes the development of other options. If you look at the EU budget, we did that 5 years ago with the Organic Research Center in UK, only 10% of the EU budget today are devoted to organic farming. Despite organic farming is far more promising for sustainable future of agriculture than GM technology. And also despite the fact that biotechnology, they received already a lot of money since the 90s. And so if they are successful, that's great. But no, I like my share of money. It seems to be difficult. That's at the system level. But if you look at the lock-ins at the actor level, because one of the questions we ask today is why the farmers are not changing of practices. Because we know the right practices, the practices that are helping the spiders, the practices that are making small fields with this strange border, and things like that. So we know the practices, but the farmers, they are not adopting these practices. And sometimes there is this implicit that it's because they are stupid, or it's because they are only interested in money. But if you look more deeply, and we did that by interviews with farmers, asking questions and taking times to discuss with them, to understand the lock-ins, most of them, they are interested in the development of more sustainable farming systems. But when they mention the lock-ins, they are again numerous. And they are in fact related to 4 dimensions. The first one is organizational. For the moment, the farmers, they have no power. Confronting, for example, the big dairy factories. We were working in this case with dairy farmers. Second, there is a lot of lock-ins related to technical dimension. If you want a more sustainable dairy production, you have to change of wheat. But the change of wheat is a very complicated thing for a farmer. The third level is a more cultural. In fact, the concept of progress in farming system, the way they were educated as producers and not as some people working with nature, has a big impact on the inability to change their practices. And finally, they are lacking knowledge, and I make the links with my previous example. We are not developing a lot of knowledge on organic farming, and the farmers, they lack knowledge to take the risk of changing of system. So all these factors are combining because they are in interaction. If you are educated as a producer, you have a given vision of progress, and you know some techniques and not the other techniques. So all these issues are, in fact, interrelated. So then the second dimension that I want to push forward is the fact that if the systems are not changing, it's often due to the fact that there is a complex network of lock-ins impeding, a bit like a spider web, impeding the change. And not a single responsible or a single silver bullet that we can use to solve the problem. And just to mention it, but it's a work in progress, we did the same work in the EU project on diversification. Teja was mentioning the importance of diversification of crops. And then we found in 25 case studies, we found 46 different factors of lock-ins impeding the development of diversification systems. So you see that it's again and again, it's a complex situation that is worthwhile, I think, studying if we want to impulse some change. So to sum up this part, actors like farmers are part of a complex social system. Farmers have a limited agency, so the ability to change is quite limited, and change can be very expensive and complex. And also, they receive contradicting message because the scientists are saying, and the NGOs are saying more biodiversity, but the way the EU rules is distributing subsidies is not exactly in line with this injunction. So they receive different messages by different advisors. As I don't want to give you a negative impression, I will try to, in my last part, to propose some solution. And I'm very sorry that there is to say that there is no solution. I'm completely, I think we have really to try to avoid this word solution. I try to push my students not using the word, you have to do that, because if you are writing a social science article, it looks like normative. And I think as more natural science scientists, we have to avoid the word solution. Why? Because we are aware, and the young people, they are very aware of that what we are looking for is a change of system. It's not a solution. It's a change of system where there is some technical innovation that can help this change of system. But if we believe that a single or two technical innovation is the solution, I don't think that we believe that we need a change of system. So for me, there is really two teams. Those who believe in solutions and they want to keep the system we have now, and those who believe that solutions are at the service of a change of system, and this one are another team. I'm quite radical on that. And if you want to change of system, then there is one solution. It's the revolution. So, but no. Hopefully, the American, they invent the revolution. But the Dutch, they invent the transition. So, some Dutch people, and it was a big budget, a research budget of the Dutch government, saying we want to impulse a transition. It was already 15 years ago. They said we want to put money to social scientists in order to provide a framework to think the transition of the Netherlands. And I think that's a very inspiring job, despite it's not perfect as all human proposition. So what's the idea of transition, which is inspired by this famous paper of Gales and Scott? The idea is to consider that there is three levels in the society. The first one is the socio-technical landscape. It is globally the global trend. As Jean-Pascal was mentioning this morning, the fact that the young are changing, the fact that Macron seems to be changing, the fact that there is a lot of interest for new issues. The second dimension is the socio-technical regime, the way the mainstream system is working today, the dairy system based on the Danone, Lactalis, Ardo model, and Arla model, and so far. And the third level is the innovation niche, where are developing new initiatives. This innovation can be technical innovation, but also social innovation. And then if you combine this, it's become this kind of picture, where you have at the top the landscape, which is more or less giving the mood. We have the regime, which is under pressure, and you have the innovation that should build up to propose a credible alternative to the regime. And the way we can help this process, and each of us can have a role in that, it's either by criticizing, pressuring the dominant regime, or legitimizing the alternatives. We had example of that all day long. And the last thing is to help this small initiative to network in order to converge and to have an influence on the system. And a good example of that is the development, for example, of renewable energy, which was really in the infancy 20 or 30 years ago, and now is seen by all the society as an alternative to the way we are producing and using energy today. And so I think the message is that we have to protect alternatives, to learn, to network, and to empower this different system. So that's my close to last slide. My idea of having an impact is first to recognize that climate, biodiversity are key challenges for societies, but also to recognize that societies are made of actors in interactions. So societies is not something like politicians are bad guys, but societies is a complicated network of actors. And if we want, if we can push a participative debate on options and scenario, it will become a major political issue. And for me, the political issue is not to say you have to act for biodiversity and climate. The political issue is to say you have to consider options, and we have to discuss together what are our horizons, what do we want as a society for the future. And so the issue of scales is a key one, the lock-ins are also a key one, and the transition theory for me provide a framework. It has to be improved, but it's a good framework to start the discussion. Last slide is, I think we have not to forget that for a big issue of today's society is social justice. And what is good for social justice is also good for biodiversity and for climate. There is some papers on that, and I think at one moment we should make them very clear that there is no contradiction with the development of well-being of humans and less inequities between humans and biodiversity and climate. They are converging issues, and that's very important, specifically considering the people from the south. I'm teaching in Burkina Faso next week, and it's important that I have a consistent message that I can use here and that I can use in Burkina Faso. Otherwise, it's senseless. And so our challenges are both ecological and social, but it's not a contradiction, it's a convergence. Thank you for your attention, and I'm happy to answer some questions.
Thank you very much for this inspiring talk. I think it brings up a